These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. And yes, we are an audio-only podcast again. Channel update at the end of the episode. You can best see the distinctiveness of ancient Babylon in the times when it's at its weakest. I was on an online forum not too long ago, and someone happened to mention Babylon. Another poster replied something that stuck with me. He said, "What is even the point of Babylon? Who cares? They only existed for less than a century, and they wrote a few laws, and then they died, and are the most overrated, boring nation in the world." End quote. Now, I don't take this too much to heart. He's a random internet person who doesn't seem to know the old Babylonian period from the Neo-Babylonian period, and probably has no idea how many years spanned from Hammurabi to Nabonidus. And that's fair enough. I don't know much about certain areas of history either. No, what really stuck with me is not that he's wrong on the facts, but that he's wrong in a deeper way that I don't think a lot of people are aware of. You see, Babylon's famous, and a lot of people have heard of Babylon, but I don't think many of us consciously realize why it's so famous. The Assyrians, for example, you can say that they were just an empire who happened to be really successful for a few hundred years. The Hittites, in a lot of ways, great story, but they were just an empire. Aram Damascus, which we saw in the last episode, was basically just another kingdom that happened to do well for a while. And then there are countless thousands of kingdoms that we don't even name because they were just like all the rest in a certain fundamental sense. They all have their stories, but there is a degree to which they are all about construction and conquering. And once those constructions crumbled and the conquests were lost, what was really left? But Babylon really is different. We talk about the accomplishments and culture of Mesopotamia and all the great things they did, from inventing writing to anchoring a significant cultural framework for the whole region. But the accomplishments of Babylon are far more the triumph of a civilization, not just a set of military achievements. The comparison to Assyria is hard not to make, especially when I nest this episode right in the middle of a bunch of long conquest narratives. We can remember this being the case all the way back in the late Bronze Age, when Tukulti-Ninurta got caught in that quagmire in Babylon. In that case, the Assyrians learned the same lesson that the American army has learned in so many wars. You can't properly win if you're gentle with your enemy. Which is, in a sense, an odd thing for the Assyrians to be the ones struggling with it. They're far more famous for being not quite so gentle. But the difference during their Babylonian occupation was that the Assyrians actually respected Babylonian culture in a way that they respected no other culture in the whole of the known world aside from themselves. Obviously, we all know about the Babylonian literary and scientific achievements. We've read nearly all of the surviving mythic literature at this point somewhere in the show, and even if it wasn't all first written by the Babylonians, most of them passed through the hands of the Babylonian literary system at some point and got improved and preserved in the process. The Babylonian scribes, moreover, were active even during the darkest periods, maintaining a literary tradition within the city even when other cities were barely scraping by. Indeed, it seems at times that even Babylon was sometimes barely scraping by, and yet people had a bit of cash to spare for the friendly neighborhood scribe. Babylon exported Oedipus school instructors. It exported experts in the priestly arts, and it exported doctors of all sorts. Something we mention less often is their skill in writing religious hymns, few of which seem interesting or relevant or really very beautiful when translated into English and separated from their cultural context, but these hymns were, in their own time, a fantastically elaborate art form, of which the Babylonians were masters. Babylonian math is hard to talk about because all of our best examples are from a very late period, so it'll have to be in a pretty late episode when we finally get to it. I promise we will when it's appropriate. But we do have enough fragments and hints to know that they were doing geometry, trigonometry, and algebra, not in the modern forms, but often, more interestingly, in very different ways than how we do it, using the peculiarities of base 60 and how their numbers are written, with a combination of dots and lines, to create neat tricks for doing math more easily. But they were doing all of these very early. We keep finding hints of the advanced stuff, which we thought was like a development of the grand final flower of Babylonian civilization. We keep finding this stuff earlier and earlier, but we don't have full treatments of it that survive until the fairly late period. Science, though, we've already looked at their observational sciences, their intricate omen lists and detailed classification schemes. And in the 50 Names of Marduk episode, we even mentioned the etymological studies that they performed. By modern standards, none of it's what we would call very accurate, but in terms of very intelligent people applying their minds to detailed investigations as best they can if in their existing cultural framework, Babylon is producing top-notch scholars pretty consistently, even in the dark ages of their history. And there were practical gains from this as well. People wouldn't spend fortunes to hire distant Babylonian physicians if they didn't produce at least some amount of improvement. And recall the suggestion that during Hammurabi's time, even invasive cranial and optical surgeries were performed, which had survival rates higher than 4 out of every 5 patients. Pretty much every nation that interacted with the Babylonians, Assyria, Greece, Persia, Israel, Egypt, basically everyone we have records of recognized that something was different about the intellectual climate of this city. I'm not going to talk about where that tradition came from today, and the truth is, I'm not really sure. Some of it was inherited from the Sumerian educational system, but Babylon built on what they inherited. What was it in their culture? What was it in their society that allowed for this when every other nation around them was just, mostly focused on surviving? I have no idea. It'd be the topic of a really long and really interesting book if we even have enough data to really get at it. But let's talk about a fine example of this intellectual climate even in this dark age, a text which may well be the oldest known political treatise, nowadays called Advice to a Prince, sometimes also called from the incipit Sharu Anadini la Ikul, or If a King Has No Regard for Due Process. And check the description on whatever you're looking at for a link to the full text of this. In form, though, it's basically an omen text where if this happens, then this will happen. But at the same time, it's clearly something different. Like the scribe who put this together had a political message that he wanted to communicate, but omen text was the format he needed to use. Maybe because omen texts were more prestigious and lent his argument a degree of technical credibility in a way that simply presenting a verbal argument might not have, or perhaps he was simply so used to omen lists that this is how he had learned to organize his thoughts. Either way, the fact that this is the main and default genre for such an innovative political work is really fascinating. It starts with, "If the king has no regard for due process, his people will be thrown into chaos, his land will be devastated." Now, I don't actually know when this particular document was discovered by the archaeologists, but as soon as they found it and translated this one line, it should have upended the entire world of political theory history, showing that people were, in fact, thinking in modern, systematic terms hundreds of years before the Greeks supposedly founded political philosophy. But at the same time, this text, I think more than other Omen texts, really drives home the fundamental ambiguity of the Omen texts as a genre, at least as we read them nowadays. If a king has no regard for due process, then his people will be thrown into chaos and his land will be devastated. Now, is the author providing a piece of advice here? Basically, is he saying, "Hey, king, it's best if you follow the law"? Or is he saying that there's a cause and effect relationship here that's like some sort of immutable, universal law? The one is inevitably caused directly by the other. Having no regard for due process directly throws the people into chaos. Simply because perhaps is that the way the universe is designed in their worldview? Or is there some unspoken causal linkage implied here? I mean, with modern political theory, we would agree with this assessment, but what we would say is that not following due process reduces a government's legitimacy and promotes corruption in business and government, both of which cause the stability of the nation to be weaker, and then when a crisis emerges, the government now lacks the tools to handle the disaster, causing it to succumb to the disaster. Or the implied linkage could be something decidedly pre-modern. A king who is not a good steward of justice, he might gain the wrath of Shamash, who will send divine power against the nation that will overcome the nation's strength. Or is there some other implied linkage here? We fundamentally don't know, at least not until we get a commentary on this particular text from the ancient world. And yes, the ancient world did have a scholastic commentary tradition, much of it centered around Babylon. But in these commentaries, the explanations are often extremely esoteric etymological explanations. And the best way I've come up with to sort of understand what they're trying to do here is rather like nowadays we try to find mathematical regularities between events because we believe that mathematics is the language that best describes reality. They, however, used the Akkadian and Sumerian languages to find regularities in the world around them, believing that their language, which they believed had been directly given to them from the gods, they believed that it was somehow tied into reality itself, the way we seem to believe that mathematics somehow ties to reality. And just as advanced math seems often like esoteric nonsense to the uninitiated, I mean, we have a whole class of values nowadays which are explicitly called imaginary numbers. Well, so too does advanced Akkadian esoteric etymology make very little sense to those among the modern world who study it, and of course, even less sense to those of us who don't study it. Anyway, for all that it seems just as obvious to us as it did to this author that lacking regard for due process will lead to national ruin, it's important that we recognize that we don't know why he thought this was the case, And we honestly can't assume that we do know why, given the large number of plausible interpretations for these political omens. It could well be multiple of the proposed options, or it could just as well be something we haven't even thought of yet. Now the next line rhymes with the first, not in the way of English rhyme, which puts similar sounds together, but in the way of Semitic rhyme that we see in biblical poetic texts, where similar ideas are restated in different words. If he has no regard for due process of his land, Ea, king of destinies, will alter his destiny, and misfortune will hound him personally. Now this is a bit different from the previous line. Here it isn't that injustice will cause the nation to collapse, but that the gods will seek out the king for punishment. It's related, you see, but it is a bit different. If he has no regard for his princes, his lifetime will be cut short. And princes here are not necessarily just his heirs, but the group of important nobles in general. If he has no regard for scholarly advisers, his land will rebel against him. And funny that the great givers of advice always advise that people listen to their advice. If he has regard for a scoundrel, the mentality of his country will alter. And this is always good advice. Bringing bad people into influential positions will be a bad influence, which seems kind of obvious, but is often missed in the moment. And the general advice ends with, if he has regard for a clever trick, the great gods will hound him into right counsel and the paths of righteousness. As getting tricked is one of the best, if least pleasant, ways to learn. And this 3,000-year-old sentiment was echoed by the great modern philosopher George W. Bush, who once said, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, you don't get fooled again." But after we get past this general advice, which is philosophically interesting in a timeless sort of way, we get to the most historically interesting part of the text. From the end of the Second Isin dynasty through the Dark Age until the Assyrians start, bothering them again, we hear almost nothing at all about what the Babylonians have been up to. Our two best sources, in fact, are not even historical sources at all. We have this advice to a prince, with a very handful of scattered Kuduru mentions that suggest that the political relations it's about to describe are, in fact, real things, and this isn't just some purely theoretical treatise. And we've got the legend of Era and Isham, which is theological allegory at best. But his mentions of the sorts of things that were happening in Babylonia during whatever bad times it happened to be describing. Plus, there are a very few scattered mentions of events, largely without any sense of sequence or scale to them. And from that, we can sort of tell a very vague story. Stepping back, first of all, the Kassites controlled Babylon during the Late Bronze Age. With the Bronze Age collapse came the fall of the Kassites, and they were replaced by the second dynasty of Isin, which had their ups and downs, but after Nebuchadnezzar I, it was pretty much all downs. They were followed by a dynasty of Sealand, and at this point it seems likely that the north and south of Babylonia were pretty well split at this point. This is different from the old Sumer and Akkad split that we knew back from the early Bronze Age, as by now the Persian Gulf has receded enough that there is a significant area south of Sumer called Sealand, which is inhabited by the swamp people, and Sumer itself is largely dead. Babylon itself was taken away from Sealand by a dynasty from the Kassite tribe of Bazi, who are a different set of Kassites than the ones who ruled in the Late Bronze Age. Then someone who may have been an Elamite takes over, And then Babylon is ruled not by any single dynasty, but by whatever strong man happens to take over. And these all being distinguished by the fact that they are native Babylonians. And so, even though it's not a dynasty, it gets called a dynasty, this period in which native Babylonians were all the king. This era is called the Dynasty of just Babylon is so poor at this point that they can't even afford a whole dynasty name, just the one letter. And there was, and maybe continues to be, a bit of debate as to whether this is like an abbreviation of some larger word, but we're pretty sure now that it really is just the Dynasty of By the time of things have fallen pretty well apart for the whole region of Babylonia. There may have been a number of invasions from the mountains, or maybe there was just the one, but the strongest sense we get is one of famine and exhaustion. The land simply isn't producing like it used to, so the surpluses are gone, and the trading partners are all equally miserable. Babylon seems unable to properly hold on to its territorial empire as the various cities of the region remember that they were originally independent nations. The youths of these generations, meanwhile, seem to have gone into various levels of revolt in each of these cities, refusing to join the military and possibly refusing to pay taxes in general. The whole situation is very poorly understood. Some think that the widespread death of this period led to a situation where labor became scarce and thus more valuable, like in Europe after the Black Death. It's also possible that the exact opposite could have happened too, where a surplus of people without the whole large-scale economy that they used to filter their talents into has built up in the cities and is banded together to fight for their rights and dignity. But whether or not they knew the economics behind their present circumstances, and probably without most of the vocabulary that we've built up around political issues, the peoples of the few remaining cities, mostly Babylon, Nippur, and Sippar, would no longer tolerate the arbitrary rule of kings without consideration being paid to the people. And so we hear, in Advice to a Prince, the following injunctions. These aren't binding laws as far as we can tell, for we don't know that any Mesopotamian king was ever formally bound beneath a constitution by his people. But in this era, the informal power of the people seems to have given it at least a degree of force. If the king denies due process to a citizen of Sippar, but grants it to an alien, Shamash, judge of heaven and earth, will establish an alien due process in his land, and neither princes nor judges will have regard for due process. Now the text keeps swapping between Nippur, Sippar, and Babylon, but we think that this is not because the different cities had different sets of customary rights, but rather this is just poetically cycling through the cities, all of which had significant independent power at this point. Astonishing that they were concerned about foreigners getting more consideration than the natives, though they were probably more concerned about the powerful and wealthy foreigners getting special treatment while regular city folk get the shaft. But I guess that sometimes happens nowadays too. We also hear, if the citizens of Nippur are brought against the king for due process, and he accepts the customary remuneration, but denies them due process, Enlil, lord of the world, will raise up against him a foreign enemy, and it will decimate his army. The prince and his administrators will prowl about the streets like vagabonds. There were court fees involved in the process of ancient justice, you see, but it seems sometimes these fees were just pocketed as corruption without any case actually being heard. Now, I'm not going to read you the whole of this text. you get the idea of the structure by now, and the punishments only seem to be poetically related to the main area of interest for us is the idea that the government is obligated to do certain things for its people, and I think it's interesting to see what things specifically they came up with. And so we hear that fines and imprisonment were not allowed to be levied by the king against the citizens of those 3 towns. One would imagine that this was not a defund the police measure, but redirecting justice from the royal level to the municipal level. The first time we've seen this decentralization in the region since the early Bronze Age. Similarly, citizens of the 3 major cities were exempt from the labor tax. They could not be conscripted either for work projects or for the military. The granaries of these cities was not to be used for royal purposes, only for city purposes. The regional government was prohibited from taxing sheep, conscripting oxen, altering land boundaries, or granting land grants to those from outside the city. The regional government is not to nullify or alter contracts and send the people to other cities, or to count them in a labor census. There was apparently an issue whereby advisors and officials were speaking against these exemptions, possibly in public or possibly to the king, saying, hey, we better get rid of these exemptions because they're weakening our nation. But fortunately, our author lets us know that these advisors are not advocating for a stronger central government out of altruistic or ideological motives. No, we hear that they're simply hoping to line their pockets, and some quite gnarly punishments are reserved for these sorts of men. At the end, these prohibitions also apply to the high temples of Sippar, Nippur, and Babylon. Overall, this is a fascinating document, and while it's debated how much the king was actually constrained by these sorts of injunctions, it's clear from both this document and some other various fragments that this was a time of very weak central authority in southern Mesopotamia, with the city-state nature of the great cities enjoying a renaissance. In a way, we have just enough to let the imagination run wild without too much constraint, as we have no idea what this situation looked like on the ground, aside from some hints that the tax and conscription exemptions were in force for at least some people some of the time. This could have been a time when the masses luxuriated in an unusually restrained government, or it could have just been a devolution to a more local form of government. As anyone who's ever been part of a homeowners association knows, that can be almost as terrifyingly tyrannical as an Assyrian army in its own way. Or perhaps the governments were just so weak and inept and incompetent that it was a time of something very close to anarchy, where everyone was poor and miserable, and violence was a constant feature of every day. All of these tax and service exemptions, though, raise the question of how Babylon managed to defend itself during this period. And part of the answer is definitely that, at least during some parts of this dark age, it largely didn't defend itself. The cities in the countryside were regularly beset by raiders from both east and west, with many coming in to occupy territory. The mountain folk from Iran made their regular terrorizing expeditions during periods of civilized weakness, as has been happening for a very long time. And the Aramaeans were beginning to settle in as well on the western and northern fringes. So too, in a way that's so far largely invisible to archaeology, the famous Chaldeans are making their entry into the region and starting to establish themselves, particularly in Sealand. Now, the Chaldeans are interesting in themselves because, of course, they will become the dominant force in Babylon through the Neo-Babylonian period. But for all their significance, we can't actually trace them in any concrete way prior to 850 BCE when Shalmaneser encounters them, seemingly fully formed and already established in Sealand. We don't, at this point, know what they're doing or how they're doing it, but we know that they are Western Semitic peoples, and you can, to one degree, say that they're basically just Aramaeans with a different paint scheme. And of course, this is about as fair as saying that Italians are basically just Spanish people with a few differences, a statement which is both horrendously unhelpful and at the same time does draw on some common threads. And in the absence of any other information at all about the early Chaldeans, we need to cling to any thread that we can find. Problem is, there are now so many Western Semitic groups, as well as other groups on the western and southern fringes of Mesopotamia, that we can't honestly say for sure that the Chaldeans came in recently. They could be a mixture or evolution of existing groups, or they could have come from, honestly, pretty much anywhere else in the Middle East and been displaced during the massive people movements of the Bronze Age collapse. We don't know when they arrived in the Sealand, we don't know how extensive they are outside of that area, and we don't know what they looked like before they set up shop in the swamp, an event which may well have involved shifts in their society. And to be sure, we know almost nothing about what they look like now that they're in the Sealand, and we're not going to be able to provide much detail at all for at least another century. Wow, that sure was an informative paragraph. But the Chaldeans are there, as are the Aramaeans and a host of other mixed groups, many of which are very slowly assimilating into the local Akkadian culture, or they're being absorbed by the Aramaeans and Chaldeans. Early Iron Age ethnography is a bottomless well, but it's one whose depths are typically lightless. But on the subject of defense directly, though there is a king in Babylon, or at least we think there was for this entire period, he nominally held control over everything from south of Assyria to the north edge of Sealand, but his actual control was often minimal. Militaries appear to have been managed not so much by the central government, but by the cities and tribes, each of which either maintained a militia for defense or would call up citizens when needed. In such circumstances, raiders thrived and rivalries kept the whole region unstable and rocked with regular outbreaks of violence. Most telling is the scarcity of kuduru around this period. In the last bout of instability during the declining decades of the Kassite dynasty, and previously in the waning years of Hammurabi's dynasty, southern Mesopotamian landholders would erect kuduru, which are large inscribed stones that would stand on their property quite visibly, quite obviously, and announce the details of some particular disputed legal matter. Perhaps the borders of a section of land, or the ownership of this or that farm plot, that sort of thing. The idea here was that central authority was probably weak or expected to weaken when people are putting these kuduru up, but the idea of law itself was generally recognized, and whatever government came next was likely to recognize such a permanent feature of both the physical and legal landscape. They're not proclaiming universal laws for all of time and space. They're saying, hey, I own this property, the line's over there, and so when a new warlord comes in, if he's not terribly worried about that particular piece of property, he's likely to just say, oh, look, yeah, there's a kuduru. That's telling us where the boundary is, should anybody come and litigate against them in the future. In this Dark Age, however, very few kuduru are recovered, possibly because people were too poor to afford what were legitimately a lot of effort to erect. More worryingly, though, it could be that people didn't put them up because they did not believe that they would be acknowledged by future warlords and rulers, or perhaps that the violence was so severe at times that these were frequently destroyed. We don't know, but things were bad. And it seems almost as if it was not any particular Babylonian strength that pulls them out of it, but the gradual recovery of the wider economy and the unifying, terrifying threat of the Assyrians. Babylon barely ever scrapes more than a few thousand men together, and given what we know of their army at this point, or lack thereof, it was almost certainly a hodgepodge of tribal soldiers and city militias, each working together just as much as they were working under the notional king. Their various forces would have been quite diverse. It was a mix of differently trained infantry, archers, and chariots, with the very earliest cavalry arriving probably a few decades after the Assyrians first demonstrated the concept to their southern neighbors. Their recruitment, training, and tactics were a mishmash, and a largely ineffective mishmash, barely managing to keep order in their own territories, and only very rarely managing anything effective against the growing Assyrian menace. But this background, the hints of chaos, both internal and external, the collapse of trade and widespread soil infertility, and the burgeoning local rights movement, flavors our understanding of Babylonian history from about 1000 to 800 BCE in a very unique way. Aside from that, pretty much all we have is a handful of royal inscriptions and Assyrian mentions, and working just from that, it would be hard to say much of interest about Babylon at all in this age. Which is why I wanted to lay all this groundwork before getting to the political history leading up to Shalmaneser's intervention. And so next time, we're going to see something of a dynasty rise up, coalescing from this chaos around the likely quite charismatic figure of Nabu-shuma-ukin, and the subsequent decline of Babylon back into chaos and obscurity. But even though the political fortunes rise and fall, keep in the back of your head the fact that the scribal and educational system is still somehow chugging along in the background, maintaining and even developing the world's oldest scholarly community. So join us next time as we get back to the more straightforward narratives of intrigue and conquest, as Babylon attempts to build an empire to rival the Assyrian one, without a great deal of success. And speaking of not a great deal of success, you may have noticed that this channel has been on rocky ground lately. There is no more pop content, no more video stuff. I simply don't have time for it. And then I got sick for a good long while, which is why I went quiet after running out of my pre-prepared episodes. But I'm back to my roots now. Every 2 weeks it will be the next chapter of this grand narrative, in audio-only format. Some people will be happy to hear that. Some people I know are disappointed, but we do what we can do. And I have every intention to continue unfolding the story of Mesopotamia for as long as I can. So make sure you're subscribed and telling your friends about the show, because though we only have 300 years left in our chronology, this period has more material than the previous 3,000 years had, which means it'll likely keep me busy for the next few years. I appreciate all your support that I've gotten so far, and as always, thank you for listening.